episode of the Best Book Club. I'm your host, NeufAtora, and this is the podcast where I discuss the best stories with the best minds in the community. On this episode, I'll be doing something a little different, a solo episode going in depth on my thoughts about Dr. Stone, a manga created by Richiro Inagaki and Boichi. Serialized from March 2017 to March 2022, this manga tells the journey of one high schooler with cheat level intelligence as he works to restore humanity from being turned to stone. If you haven't read this manga yet, stop listening to this and go read it. It is absolutely incredible. Massive spoiler warning for the entire series from here on out, so be aware of that. So to dive right in, as soon as your eyes hit the first panel, you're pulled into the world Inagaki has written and Boichi has masterfully brought to life. Right off the bat, you're given two characters who are larger than life in Senku and Taiju, making them easily relatable and easier to care about because their personalities and emotions are on full display. So you're able to get a good idea on who these characters are extremely quickly, and then you have the rest of the series to fully explore their personalities. Or at least Senku. I have some issues with Taiju that I'll bring up later. As soon as Senku first appears, he is instantly memorable. At first, I thought it was just a chibi version of Ken from Sun Ken Rock by Boichi, one of the best mangas out there and one I'll definitely be doing an episode on at some point. But he almost immediately stands apart because of the personality and characteristics that are shown briefly before the mass petrification happens. You're already interested in him, questioning his morality and how he feels about other characters, and it's only been a few pages. And then immediately following the bombastic introductions, Inagaki pulls a brilliant 180 by bringing about the apocalypse during a typical manga love confession, completely defying expectations and setting a high standard for the rest of the manga to follow, which it almost entirely lives up to. And these 180 shifts will become a central identifying aspect of the manga. The sequence of pages showing the destruction caused by everyone turning to stone is legitimately terrifying and actually feels apocalyptic. So many works of apocalyptic fiction go with the usual suspects of things like zombies, world ending natural disasters, and extraterrestrial invasions. And while the petrification being can be considered a world ending disaster, it is a world ending disaster, but it's not a natural disaster. So to have a story do something entirely new and fresh is wonderful. Those cliche events are so worn out and tired at this point that the ones who use it end up feeling like more of the same and played out half the time. Now, since all humans and swallows being turned to stone is something novel, you're automatically wondering how it happened and why. Two questions Inagaki painstakingly unravels throughout the course of the story, giving the entire manga a constant, pervasive feeling of mystery and intrigue. Little clues are dropped and figured out along the way, and the best part of it all is that it's all 100% grounded in real life, except the big reveal at the end. Each time a question is answered, five more take its place, and they're all just as interesting as the previous question, if not more so. Now, I wonder if it would have been more effective to have the first half of chapter 1 flipped, where the flashbacks of what happened just before Taiju started confessing to Yuzuriya are shown before the actual petrification. Seeing some context from the rest of the day makes me see it flowing better that way rather than having some grand crazy thing happen and then immediately jumping back and forth between present and past. It feels like Inagaki was far more focused on grabbing readers with a wild opening rather than investing in his characters and allowing them to hook the readers, at least initially. Once you move past the opening, all the focus shifts onto the characters, and I absolutely love it. This sudden shifting of tones that I brought up just a bit ago carries throughout the rest of the manga. And the more extreme the switch, the more effective it tends to be. Inagaki has a very sweet and innocent moment, for example. He has a very sweet and innocent moment happen between Taiju and Yuzuriya at a vet, and then jumps back to the present, where a dog is running around its petrified owner, then trembling in the rain and whimpering. And this constant back and forth shift in emotions between heartwarming and gut punch is something to marvel at for how effective it is at drawing the reader in through juxtaposition. It's two conflicting forces that normally would never come together, but being brought together in this way, it automatically draws you in to you're curious to see how it will play out. So the first half of chapter 1 is jam-packed with characterization and scene setting. So much happens even before the name of the chapter is revealed, and by this point I'm always fully strapped in and ready to take the ride. Though one of the only actual gripes I have with Dr. Stone stems from this initial chapter. Inagaki focuses extremely heavily on Taiju's feelings for Yuzuriya in the first section of the story, even making it the sole reason Taiju was able to break free on his own. But absolutely nothing comes of it until the literal end of the series. Leaving plot points open and then resolving them much later down the line can be a fantastic method of storytelling when done correctly. But with how big Dr. Stone's cast gets later on, a few plot points like Taiju's feelings end up ultimately feeling forgotten and pushed aside in favor of the new and shiny replacements. Inagaki does an astounding job of making us care about the characters he's created, but does an absolutely terrible job sometimes at having those characters stay relevant or even show up at all later on. I end up feeling like a waste of my time caring about people like Taiju and Rory because they really don't have much of an impact on the story beyond a certain point. And in a medium where you have 100% control over absolutely everything, and you're basically the god of that universe, it's pretty hard to believe that characters who were so integral before are now completely missing in action, and you can't figure out a way to get them back in the story. Taiju especially doesn't make much sense to me, as you'll basically always need muscle to get things done. And with the level of intensity that Senku's plans reach, the work probably would have gone much smoother if Taiju had been there. Not to mention that he is, for all intents and purposes, Senku's best friend, until Kohaku ultimately usurps that position. He really just ends up feeling like a discarded toy that a child got bored of and found a better version of in the form of Nikki, Tsukasa, Hyoga, Magma, the power team. So many characters come in and just fill that position of strong person, and it's disappointing. It's the same kind of thing that happened to Chad in Bleach. Initially, Chad was Ichigo's best friend, always there and being a major asset in whatever situation he'd gotten into. But eventually, Uryu usurped his position and Chad basically lost all relevance. And that's how Kohaku comes into the picture. The most well known example of that sort of replacement dynamic is Yamcha from Dragon Ball. And the comparison between Yamcha and Chad is even more on point, since both end up basically being one of the strongest humans in their universes. Taiju reminds me of an even more extreme Hyro from the disastrous life of Psyche Kuso, or Psyche K, which is another incredible manga that I'll be covering at some point. They are different characters created by completely different people, but extreme stamina and positivity are hallmark traits of Taiju and Hyro, as well as brown spiky hair. Taiju's feelings also bring up the question of how he was able to survive just by focusing on confessing to Yuzuriya. For the rest of the manga, Taiju is characterized as having cheat level of endurance, as described by Senku, but I can't merge the two ideas of Taiju having one of the highest mental fortitudes of anyone on the planet behind Senku and Zeno, and the series being grounded in pretty strict realism. There are a few times where Dr. Stone breaks away from that realism, and each time it's extremely obvious to me, and I never care for it, but for the most part, it rigidly sticks to the rules Inagaki has laid out. I think a part of this comes from my disappointment on how irrelevant Taiju becomes in favor of newer characters who are essentially the exact same thing. Characters with extreme personalities and quirks that border on being a caricature but never cross the line. Or, as I said earlier, characters who fill up the power team and just completely make Taiju irrelevant. And this is something that media in general attempts to do: create over the top characters with relatable personalities so people can latch onto and identify with them. Characters who remind consumers of aspects of their life while whisking them away to a far more enjoyable and fantastical world and adventure. Now, Sukasa is wonderfully foreshadowed as Taiju starts wandering around after breaking free, though I've never really cared for his nickname, to be honest. The strongest primate high schooler is so long that I really can't imagine anyone actually taking the time to say it unless they're supposed to for the sake of the story, which breaks my immersion. A nickname is supposed to be something concise and easy to remember that generally rolls off the tongue, and the strongest primate high schooler is none of those things. The only reason it's memorable is because it's so ridiculous and long that it would only exist in something like a manga. And when I'm enjoying what's happening and immersing myself, the last thing I want is to be reminded that it isn't real and it's just a story. Taiju trying to say how he feels to the petrified Yuzuriya is super emotional, even though these characters have just been introduced, because of the quality of Inagaki's writing and Boichi's art. And now seems like the best time to talk about Boichi's art. I've been a huge fan of Boichi since I first read Sunken Rock years ago. That manga has the absolute best, most stunning art I've ever seen in a manga or manhwa, and that's also true for Origin and Wallman, two works that are also set in the Sunken Rock universe. There are plenty of comedic moments littered throughout Sunken Rock, and the faces of characters express that, but the overall style of that manga is grounded in reality, in an artistic sense. I said earlier that Senku looks like a chibi version of Ken, and he definitely does, but the more cartoonish style that Boichi went for with Dr. Stone allowed him to do wilder and more expressive facial expressions than he could ever achieve with true to life faces. At the same time, because Boichi is able to create such high quality art, he's able to balance ridiculous expressions with very serious looks and panels, and that balance is such a treat to behold. I'll never get tired of reading anything done by Boichi because, regardless of the story, I know I'll always have insanely impressive visuals to enjoy. Another thing that I absolutely love is the use of subtlety. Two great examples of this come from Senku, the first being that he never talks about his own intelligence. He shows it through his actions, and then other people recognize it. Being able to convey important details and characteristics of characters in dialogue is a pretty necessary skill to have if you want to make your writing sound just that much more professional. Basically, all you have to work with when it comes to words on the page in manga are dialogue and thoughts. So, knowing how to convey that information in the most natural way possible without overloading readers or being heavy handed is even harder in some regards than writing a novel or story, since you don't have pages of space to write out exactly what you want to say and exactly how you want to say it through words. You have to do it through dialogue, thoughts, and visuals, and so mediums like manga are able to attain a different level of storytelling that's extremely enjoyable and wholly unique. It's sort of a perfect marriage between movies or TV and novels. Chapter 2 does a fantastic job of showing the passage of time and kicks off the trend of superrealism that the rest of the manga would mostly follow. Science really can be awesome, and showing it at work in such a visceral way as depetrifying a bird conveys that extremely well. And so, going along with that, I legitimately get excited whenever Senku says to get excited, because this manga actually allows characters to be intelligent and shows that the human brain is really only limited by itself. Too many media franchises have extremes where characters are either incredibly dumb or incredibly smart with no in between. And it generally doesn't make much sense beyond this is funny, so we're doing it, or the plot demands it, so we're doing it. The beauty of intelligent characters in Dr. Stone is that they're believably intelligent. They aren't completely running circles around other people or adults with random wit. All the knowledge they have comes from real world sources and can be replicated. Now, while it is a little outlandish that Tsukasa would be able to kill a lion with just a punch and not even breaking a sweat, it is quite a badass introduction and leaves one hell of an impression. The first high five immediately following this is shared between Senku and Tsukasa, and that's always shown to happen between Senku and someone who rivals him in being a master of some aspect of life, which makes me wonder why Senku doesn't do the first one with Taiju, especially after they're able to ascertain the correct formula for the depetrification fluid. I think part of it comes down to whether Senku recognizes and respects the person or not, though this is a very minor thing. So who knows? Maybe there is an answer. Maybe it's just one of those doesn't matter, so it doesn't need to be explained kind of things. I do love how the idea of creating smartphones is seeded into the narrative as early as chapter 4. Every time it's brought up, I'm right there with Senku thinking, man, how dumb can you be, Taiju? Technology isn't even close to being close to achieving something like that in this stone world. And then Senku actually lays out a plan to create smartphones. And I'm blown away like the rest of the spectators. So much of this manga clearly shows how far ahead Inagaki was thinking when writing it, and I absolutely love that. Whenever Taiju proposes the idea, it always makes me think of Jesse from Breaking Bad when he and Walter become stranded in the desert with their lab. Walter tries to teach Jesse about making batteries, but Jesse's answer to Walter's question about a conductive element is wire. It's one of the best scenes in the show, and you should at least watch that one on YouTube or somewhere if you haven't seen the show yet or you aren't planning to. It is hilarious, and you don't need to see any other part of the show to understand what's going on in that moment. It's just a moment of pure comedy. Senku saying that there are four uses for calcium carbonate makes me question the consistency of his thought process. Before this, he brings up a concern with Taiju about Tsukasa being able to completely overpower them if he wanted to, and yet he lets this slip. It might be that Senku just wasn't fully aware of the danger Tsukasa posed, or he underestimated Tsukasa's intelligence after spending so long with just Taiju as a companion, or it could have happened purely to drive the plot forward, which is the kind of the corner that I'm leaning into because Senku is never shown to really make mistakes like this ever. So I'm not sure. I'm not entirely sure what's going on with that. Dr. Stone has a wonderful way of constantly keeping the tension up while never feeling artificially inflated, at least until the final stretch of chapters. The main characters are always in a race against something, whether that's against Tsukasa, Rory's pneumonia, Dr. Zeno, or the numerous other threats they face, and it all feels like a natural progression of events. No one's motives feel out of place. It would make sense that multiple people would try to take control of a fresh world, and that many people would try to stop those kinds of people. And so with all those these power hungry morons trying to take control, I have so much respect for Senku. One of the traits I value highest in people is decisiveness, and Senku is able to consistently make decisions in extreme circumstances and then stand behind those decisions where most others would at least take way longer to decide or be paralyzed by indecision, especially at points like the smoke signal in Chapter 8. Having to decide whether to risk your life to alert people you don't know actually exist and let a murderer know exactly where you are when you know what'll do to you, or let it pass and keep Tsukasa in the dark, is an extremely tough decision because it all rests on whether or not their gunploy will actually work. And this carries on through the rest of the manga. The characters in the Kingdom of Science always make the decision that's based on hope rather than preservation, even with people like Gen. Gen's decision to join the Kingdom of Science is split into having an incredibly easy and instantly gratifying world under Sukasa's rule, or regaining the life he once had far off down the road beside Senku. And that really is the true difference between Sukasa's way and Senku's way. They both want to have an ideal world, but where the former is selective of who can join him, the methods he uses are reprehensible, and he sits at the top, the latter works with everyone and truly is kind hearted to a fault, always staying equal with the people who follow him. It's the difference between a dictator and a guide. One of the things pushing that is the fact that Byakuya is one of the best dads in fiction. Senku isn't his biological son, but he does literally everything possible to make sure Senku is happy and fulfilled, including selling his car. But what really sets him apart is that he parents by example. He consistently shows Senku that anything is possible as long as you put your mind to it, which is then proven when Byakuya is able to become an astronaut despite not being able to swim initially. Byakuya is a super inspiring character, and I wish we'd gotten to see more of him, though the short spin off titled Dr. Stone Reboot Byakuya does wonders in that regard, as well as showing what his entire crew was up to in the time immediately following the mass petrification. It's absolutely worth reading, and since it's only 9 chapters, it doesn't take long to get through. It isn't considered canon for some reason, but it basically is, since it uses all of the same elements for Dr. Stone, and that part of the story isn't really explored at all. We get pieces of their life while on the island, but that spin off dives a lot more into the initial life of the astronauts. The single panels of Senku allowing emotion to overtake him are some of the most powerful in the manga, showing the tiniest glimpse of real humanity, and then immediately having Senku push his emotions down and steel himself to deal with the overwhelming situation they're faced with is stunningly well done. Two of my favorite examples of this are Senku finding the petrified taiju in chapter 12, and Senku and Tsukasa having a conversation right before Senku freezes Tsukasa to preserve him until they can make more miracle liquid in chapter 83. There are moments when nothing needs to be said because so much is conveyed without words. And whenever moments like that come up, it makes me love manga more than novels. The two are usually equal in my mind, but where novels only have words to be able to speak to readers and convey emotions and ideas, manga is able to show far more and tell far less. Both have their strengths and weaknesses, but there really isn't anything that can replace manga. There are some panels where Senku shows fear for a second, despite his outward confidence and apathy, and those are just another way to convey the real humanity of Senku, showing that he really isn't above it all, and actually fully understands the danger of things like trying to collect sulfuric acid with only rudimentary equipment. He puts on a big show of confidence, but when actually faced with death, even he has to stop for a moment. The stylistic touches of video game aspects is a very small but effective method of setting this manga apart from so many others. The little text boxes that show up whenever the Kingdom of Science acquires a new technology are great, but it goes deeper than that, seeping into the dialogue of major characters like Senku and combining previous texts into a puzzle. Introducing a mechanic in a video game and then stacking it with others in a new way is great gameplay, and by writing and drawing the manga to feel like a video game, it elevates the reader's experience, almost like manga and video games themselves are separate mechanics and are being stacked in Dr. Stone. The pulley system that Senku rigs up to free Kohaku from the fallen tree in chapter 16 is a great example of this at work. It's a perfect way to show a natural chain of events, especially in a manga that focuses on science and trial and error. Now, I think it's a great touch that multiple women fall for Senku in some form. It allows for some great natural comedy to develop and makes a lot of sense. People are attracted to confidence and passion, both of which Senku practically oozes like Zaraki or Ichigo do Reiatsu in Bleach. It's a bit of a shame that more isn't done with any of the proposed love interests, but that does also make sense since I can't see Senku ever giving up on something he set his sights on in favor of a woman. There is a moment later on where one character says maybe he'd be affected if their situation wasn't so dire, but I can't really imagine Senku ever taking time off from science or splitting his interests, especially when you look at the end of the series and he's doing something completely ludicrous that has absolutely no reason to exist into making a time machine. So it's pretty hard to imagine that Senku would ever do anything besides further his knowledge of science. Now, Chapter 17 introduces a whopping 40 new characters once Senku gets to Ishigami Village, which is absolutely insane. And each one of them looks different from the rest. Only around 12 actually have an effect on the narrative, but that works in the manga's favor. If every single character had a major impact, readers would probably feel a little overwhelmed from trying to remember each character in turn. But having multiple stay in the background allows the story to feel more real. Senku realistically wouldn't have the time to engage with each person, though one of the most prominent ends up being Chrome. When Senku is telling Chrome about how the world was 3,700 years ago, a little robot shows up in one of the panels, and I can't help but wonder if that's a reference to the little robot from Origin by Boichi that the titular main character creates. Might just be a fun little Easter egg for those who have read his other works. The first scientific roadmap, shows up in chapter 20, detailing the steps to creating antibiotics. And these roadmaps are fantastic visualizations of the step by step process to achieve whatever the goal is at that time. Inagaki could have bogged readers down with the minutiae of the exact scientific process, but that wouldn't be very interesting to most people, though I won't lie, it probably would have been pretty interesting to me. Showing an outline of the plan rather than painstakingly detailing every last step is a genius decision, as the roadmaps give just the highlights and the manga can then skip over the actual work for the most part, allowing space for character moments or growth or other details to take center stage. They tease readers with a full explanation on how it works, but appeal to people who have an interest in learning and science as well as those who don't. If you're interested, the manga is a good reference to then research whatever topic it is on your own. Of course, that won't be nearly as fun since you won't have the characters of Dr. Stone to interact with, but it's probably the best way they could have portrayed science in a visual medium. If Senku were evil, he'd probably be able to take over the world pretty easily. Aside from his intelligence, one of his outstanding traits is the ability to manipulate people into doing what he wants, and this is shown off constantly. In fact, Senku might be the single most successful manga character ever. He's just a human, albeit with an insanely incredible brain. And then you compare, like, he's just a human compared to all of these other characters from other mangas that are aliens or have superpowers of some kind. Senku is just a human, albeit with an insanely incredible brain, and yet he's able to not only survive in what's essentially a post apocalyptic world by himself for 6 months, but also figure out how to depetrify people and save every single person on the moon, and then go to the fucking moon. That last one takes multiple years to be fair, but realistically, how many of us on the planet could figure out even the first step to take in building a functioning rocket, let alone making it to the fucking moon? Senku is the definition of where there's a will, there's a way, and being able to witness his journey is such a treat. Soika takes up a good majority of the times where things stray a little from the hyperrealism of the rest of the manga. Her helmet is kind of odd, and as to how it came to be, I have no idea. None of the villagers understand what visual impairment is beyond calling it blurry eye disease until Senku illuminates them on what's really going on. So I find it a little hard to believe that any of them, even Kaseki the master craftsman, would be able to devise something to improve vision. Also, how is she able to fit entirely in the helmet and roll around without getting extremely dizzy extremely quickly? Senku speculates that the helmet works through the pinhole effect, but if there isn't glass in the holes in the helmet, then I don't see how that effect applies at all, because the holes are as big as her eyes, so the light that enters through them wouldn't be narrowed at all. So there really is no pinhole effect going on. In the same vein as that, I don't really care for Gen's speech idiosyncrasies. Calling everyone dear is fine. It gets a little old after a while, but the partial pig Latin is the annoying thing to read. His design and motivation are already very unique, so I don't get why he needed to have some kind of speech quirk like a cliche manga comedy relief character, which is what he becomes, and it's a little annoying. Maybe it's just another thing reinforcing Gen's duplicity and being hard to read, but it really feels unnecessary. I end up having to spend more time figuring out what the hell he's saying because the words are all switched around than I do actually enjoying his character, and that's my problem with it. Gen is a very interesting character, and his motivation and personality are unlike basically every single other character, yet there's a barrier to entry and enjoyment in the form of partial pig Latin. Now, the rules of the Grand Bout are interesting, to say the least. The first rule is anyone aged 14 or older and unmarried can participate. I can imagine the life expectancy of the village doesn't even come close to modern day, and that's probably why they only have 40 capable people. But that rule means there's a chance a 14-year-old could become the leader and be married to whoever is the shamaness. Ruri is the only person we ever see as a shamaness, and she's 18 when the Kingdom of Science first comes upon her. But for all we know, there could have been a very old shamanist in the past who ended up being married to a very young winner of the Grand Bout. And that brings up another question I have about the village. If they only have a tiny amount of people to make children with, wouldn't some kind of inbreeding or incest happen at some point? I can understand at first, since there are multiple unrelated people who found the village, that there wouldn't be anything like that. But after a few generations at most, there has to be some kind of poor DNA carried onto a child through bloodlines mixing and interlacing. I suppose they could have just banished that child like they did to the criminals that they say they banished long ago. But then that brings up the question of what happened to the banished people. Most likely they just died out, though there might have been some interesting events that happened to them. In fact, there are so many potential stories that would make for super interesting side narratives, but are completely bypassed. Those banished criminals could have been the ones who found the petrification, who founded the petrification kingdom, where Abara, Amaryllis, and all of them reside. But nope, that island was the actual landing spot of the astronaut crew, despite so much of the story basically outright confirming that Ishigami Village was the original. So bringing it back to the ground bout rules, the seventh one states the runner-up from the last tournament will serve as referee and enforce these rules, which is a little humiliating for the person who almost won. It also takes them out of the running for the next tournament, and that's kind of strange to me. Wouldn't the village want a strong chief? And wouldn't the runner-up want another chance at victory? The grand bout only happens once a generation, but how do they determine when one generation ends and another begins? It could be as simple as the kids of the current villagers are the next generation, but that in itself isn't very simple, since I can't imagine every person who has a child has one at the exact same time. Do the people of Ishigami Village have their menstrual cycles linked up? Are they regulated on when they're allowed to perform sexual acts? I got no clue on that. It's just a bizarre thing. Kaseki is fucking awesome. He's probably the most skilled of any person in the village, and possibly one of the most skilled in the world at working with his hands alongside Joel. Being able to craft a perfect flask the first time he ever encounters glass, and replacing the diamonds and the Medusa devices that are light years beyond any human technology, especially someone who's lived for 50 years in extremely primitive technology. And that's just two of his incredible exploits. He's not the deepest character ever, but he's so endearing. I don't see how anyone couldn't love a guy like that. Going back to life expectancy, Kaseki is confirmed to be 60 years old in Volume 4, which is a pretty high lifespan given how dangerous and primitive the world has become. Either he's incredibly talented at staying safe, he's super lucky, or the life expectancy is actually closer to modern day than a stone world would have you believe. That does make sense to some degree, since the village was founded by people who trained to survive in space, albeit with highly advanced equipment to help them. So I'm sure they passed on survival knowledge to their descendants, and it's probably in the 100 tales the shamanist has a duty to remember. Now, one of the very few times Senku's thought process is shown while calculating something is during chapter 38, and even a boring math calculation is made to be intense through Boichi's stellar art. It also helps that it isn't for more than a few panels, and it isn't shown very often. In those moments, you get an insight into just how powerful Senku's brain is, being able to retain information like the solar constant and the rate of heat radiation while mentally calculating how long Chrome would need to set Magma's clothes on fire. I have trouble doing slightly complex multiplication and division without writing it down. So for Senku to be able to perform ridiculously complex calculations like that purely in his mind is wild. And I remember when I read the Chrome versus manga fight for the first time and being on the edge of my seat, wondering how the Kingdom of Science would be able to pull off a victory. I figured they'd win somehow, since I started reading Dr. Stone for the first time around a month after the final chapter released, and was able to see that it ran for almost 200 more chapters. Seeing Chrome apply a scientific solution to beating Magma and figuring it out before Senku got me legitimately cheering. It makes me think that if Chrome had been born before the mass petrification, he probably would have been just as knowledgeable as Senku. The moments of Chrome putting his skills to the test really show that he's just as intelligent as Senku. He simply has the extreme disadvantage of being born in the wrong time period. Going off of that, Senku winning the grand bout by default is such a great subversion of expectations. Each fight so far has been really intense, with the exception of Chrome versus Mantle. But even then, there's an actual fight. Here, though, Chrome passes out before anything actually happens during the match, and so Senku and Chrome don't have to fight, meaning readers aren't torn on who they want to win. It does happen coincidentally, but the end result of Senku becoming chief of the village is basically what Byakuya intended for Senku. Immediately following this, Senku agrees to marry Ruri and then divorces her a second later, which is yet another 180 that works extremely well. And then Ruri conveys to Senku the core knowledge of Ishigami village passed down from shamanist to shamanist, revealing that Byakuya is the founder, and it was all set up to help Senku should he ever revive on his own. That reveal is so well done. I absolutely was not expecting it in my first read, even with the slight hint Rory gives before the grand bout. It is just one of the best reveals in the entire manga. Now, up to chapter 40, Boichi had no fan service or anything even in the vicinity of fan service besides women have boobs. Yet in that chapter, he has Rory take the antibiotics in a pose that, at this point, is basically the signature and cliche pose of any OnlyFans girl. It makes sense that she's sitting down, since she still has pneumonia at this point and is super weak, but I really don't get why she needs to press her arms together. I won't lie, I do really enjoy ecchi manga, so I don't care about fan service generally, but in this instance, it does kind of take me out of the story, since the manga is based almost entirely in reality and science, not sexual gratification. I might just be looking at the art a little too critically, but it is damn near impossible to not picture that my mouth is ready for your dick pose when seeing that panel. The masterful result of Inagaki's writing and Boichi's art comes in the form of the one-on-one conversations Senku has with various characters. And the first one that always gets me emotional is Senku being brought to the village graveyard by Ruri. Inagaki could have just had Ruri tell Senku the final tale in an expository way, but showing what happened is so much more effective and further deepens the emotional weight of the whole situation. It's not easy to create something interesting, even more so if you're trying to emotionally affect your readers. And the team who made Dr. Stone show time and time again that they know exactly how to manipulate your emotions into whatever they want you to feel. Manga truly is art, and having these shining examples of that, I mean, there really isn't anything like it. And after Soika's helmet is smashed by magma, there's a period of time where her face is uncovered, meaning she doesn't have any tools to help improve her vision. Yet she's shown to not have to squint at all to see things. Her vision hasn't magically been fixed, and they definitely don't have laser eye surgery, so I really don't know why this is the case. Maybe she's just alright with only being able to see blurry images, and so she doesn't try to squint to see better. Though it's hard to believe that at least some of the villagers, like Chrome and Kohaku, wouldn't try to create some kind of device to help her see, especially when Chrome has been shown to think up uses for the tech they've created on his own without direction from Senku at that point. When Soika was on her own after the Kingdom of Science win against Xeno's group, Soika decided to forgo her helmet, but at that point she's been exposed to science for multiple years and learns a lot more through practically applying it with trial and error. So I can definitely see her fashioning some kind of item for seeing better at that point. Her grown up design has her sporting an updated version of her helmet where it's just the bottom half and the lenses stick up past the frame, so to speak, of the helmet, like a specialized form of glasses. And I can absolutely see Soika fashioning something so she can be more precise as she outgrows her helmet. But of course, that time period is completely skipped over. We don't get to see any of it. I don't know why. Would have been really nice. Senku choosing Magma to accompany him and Chrome to find more tungsten is such a perfect choice narratively. Obviously, Magma has incredible strength, so he'll be able to actually mine the minerals. But when looking at the story, it's a chance for Magma to prove himself. He's given the temptation of taking out Senku and Chrome and becoming chief of the village finally, yet he chooses to grow as a person instead, using his brain to realize he's better off with science than fulfilling his desires. Inagaki and Boichi even have Magma try to betray them when they get to the mica, only to reveal that Magma really has changed as a person and is able to set aside his wants and emotions to help the group survive. It might primarily be that he's just trying to get out of the pitfall to save himself, but even such a minor and temporary villain is given a chance to change. In chapter 70, Senku details how to make your own paper, and I think that is super cool. Before reading Dr. Stone for the first time, I had no idea you could make paper yourself, or that it would be as easy as it is. All you have to do is gather whatever plants you can find, like grass clippings, then boil it in baking soda and bleach, rinse it out, press it into sheets, and let it dry. I haven't tried to do it yet, but I definitely will. Probably never use it for anything, but just having paper that I created would be incredible. Nothing but music really gets me excited and interested, like anything to do with writing. Not even even down to the basic materials needed to write. The final assault on Tsukasa's forces to capture the Miracle Cave is fast paced and intense, though, unless you're reading that part with manga logic in mind, it doesn't really make sense that it would only take 20 seconds. Right after Senku's team fires the tank cannon, he, Chrome, and Gen all say something after each other, and that's supposed to take only 1 second. Yet, if you were to isolate what each person says individually, none of them would be able to say their lines in under a second, let alone all three combined. That would take at least a couple seconds, if not longer. I know that is a super minor thing, but it could have easily made a lot more sense if each character said their dialogue in between other events happening, instead of right after each other. That's one of the moments where the realism slips away for a second, and as I said earlier, it really sticks out. This is an extremely common trope in manga and anime, where somehow characters are thinking or speaking far more than would make any sense in the time period they do it in. The only work I've ever seen it make sense in is Psyche K, where there's actually an explanation for how characters are able to do this. Kuso is a psychic with basically every single power you could imagine, and so one of the things he does is perform worldwide mind control to change the speed at which people process information. It is still very out there, but in the context of a manga where insane shit like that happens regularly, it's not really out of place. Any other scenario just doesn't make much sense. and it's a very well known and satirized trope. Even though Taiju loses basically all relevance after the Stone Wars arc, it's so nice that even he gets a moment to shine with science and show whatever rudimentary intelligence he has by bellowing into the Sonic cannon. Nobody tells him what to do, and it doesn't seem like they plan for him to do that based on the reactions of the people closest in proximity to him. He just knows how the cannon works and is able to figure out a solution from it being broken. Despite that tactic taking up a decent amount of space in the chapter compared to the rest of the Blitzkrieg, the subtext is very understated. Nothing is said about it after, it just happens. And that's the perfect way to show Taiju being intelligent without contradicting his previous characterization. In fact, at the end of chapter 77, Inagaki, or Mecha Senku, shows the team knows exactly what they're doing with Taiju. While answering a fan question, Mecha Senku says each individual has a different role on the battlefield. Taiju's role may seem boring and thankless, but being a humble, unsung hero suits him quite well. Even Ginro, possibly the sleaziest of all in the entire manga, not even possibly, he is the sleaziest, is given a chance to be intelligent. When Ibarra realizes their island has been invaded, he brings Rusoi's petrified body to the village to have people prove their loyalty by smashing it. Kohaku is immediately enraged by this, but Ginro reasons with her, saying they can just put him back together and revive him. One of the true strengths of Dr. Stone is that characters are never locked into one path. They're always given a chance to shine in a way they don't normally, allowing for a little bit of natural growth and more realistic characters. People are varied and complex, so forcing your characters to stay as one thing for the entire time they're on screen makes them feel more like Saturday morning cartoons as opposed to living, breathing people. Hyoga's face reveal is extremely creepy. The cracks around his mouth are genuinely off putting, so no matter if he has something covering the lower half of his face or not, you know he's a villain through and through. It's details like this that really hammer home how well realized every character is in this manga, helped by so many of those details never being lingered on or given any real focus. They're just little pieces of the much vaster picture, tiny morsels that are dropped and then swept on by, selling the idea of a huge machine with so many moving parts. Yet another fantastic switch happens right after Senku revives Tsukasa's little sister Mirai. It's a huge moment of relief and victory that's destroyed in an instant by Hyoga. So almost the moment that Tsukasa and Mirai finally come together, they're pulled apart again. There are so many moments like this where the Dr. Stone team flex their mastery over the emotions of readers. Tension has been building up for chapters as the Kingdom of Science prepares for a full scale assault on the Sakasa Empire. And then the story ramps it up even higher with the actual conflict, which could have easily gotten a little sloppy with so many moving parts in one location and all of them doing their own thing. There's only a second to breathe as Senko and company pull a victory out of thin air before the dial is turned right back up again with Hyoga's betrayal. Though there's also a hint of relief due to Senku and Tsukasa finally teaming up as they should have from the start. Speaking of Senku and Tsukasa, there's a piece of art showing both of them linking arms at the end of chapter 81 that looks exactly like a younger version of Ken and Kim Bong Fun. I'm not entirely sure how you pronounce his name. Kim Bon Fung from Sunken Rock. All the characters in each of Boichi's works are visually distinct from one another within their own series, with the exceptions of Kohaku and Ruri, since they're twin sisters, and Moz and Matsukaze, who just look exactly the same. They have the same design. But Boichi does tend to reuse character designs between series. I'm a forever fan of his, but if it's possible for a flaw to exist in his art, it'd be that his series tend to homogenize in a way. It works for Sunken Rock, Origin, and Wallman since they're all set in the same universe, but just adding some shading to Boichi's art in Dr. Stone makes the comparison undeniable. There's a panel in chapter 212 that shows a person being revived who looks exactly like Choi Bei Dal, the monk turned casino director from Sunken Rock. The guy only shows up for one panel, but he's got the bald head, thick eyebrows, mustache, and facial structure. That sort of character design reuse, I don't have a problem with at all because it's such a short appearance. The best way to describe it would be like thinking of an incredible performance by an actor, like Anthony Hopkins as Hannibal Lecter in Silence of the Lambs, or John Krasinski as Jim Halpert in The Office. Those two actors delivered spectacularly, and now I can't see them as anything but those characters. The designs that Boichi created for Sunken Rock are so iconic and intrinsically linked to it that I can't help but view characters who have similar designs as those original characters. I'd say Chapter 83 is the second of I get one of the two most emotional in the series, and the lesser of the two. The Kingdom of Science has finally beaten the Tsukasa Empire, and so with Tsukasa being gravely injured by Hyoga's betrayal, Senku needs to free Tsukasa until they're able to figure out the secret to petrification. Senku was never one for wasted time, being an efficiency powerhouse, but in this moment, they have some small talk. These two have been mortal enemies almost the entire time they've known each other, yet they've been able to look past their surface level quarrels to understand and respect each other's ideals and motivations, fully seeing where the other person is coming from. Neither Senku or Tsukasa are actually evil people, unlike Hyoga and the later Ibara. While Senku is shown as taking the correct path, Tsukasa's motivation is entirely understandable and comes from a place of real emotion. Tsukasa's primary exposure to science has been medical equipment to keep his sister alive and martial arts tactics, two things which can very easily cause a negative perception of science to form. If it weren't for these scientific aspects, he'd be free to live and enjoy his life, but instead he's chained to his situation. He was already very skilled in martial arts, and so after performing for long enough, he probably started to feel trapped in that scenario. Senku takes advantage of this trait to help sway negotiations in his favor when Tsukasa catches up to him, Taiju and Yuzuriya at Hakone, realizing that Tsukasa will avoid violence if he can. Tsukasa was exposed to the negative side of science, and having to work with money most likely forced him to deal with a lot of the people he calls corrupt, whereas Senku experienced the positive side. Dr. Stone shows numerous times how Senku comes up with an idea and then is rewarded with success through diligence, using those successes to improve his life. He also has Super Dad Byakuya in his corner, where Tsukasa had no role models and was entirely alone. This fundamental difference between the two and how expertly Inagaki plays with it is what makes the dynamic between Senku and Tsukasa one of the most fascinating in the series. I think the main reason why I don't really care for some of the other characters, and one in particular, Ryusui, as much as others, is that Ryusui specifically feels like a caricature more than anyone else. His entire character is that he's greed personified, which sure can be interesting, but when the character is just repeating himself at basically any point he gets about how he's the greediest man in the world, it gets kind of boring. There really aren't many characters in the series who aren't some kind of caricature, but at least with characters like Taiju, who are pretty much on the same level as Ryusui and not feeling the most three dimensional, they're shown in multiple different scenarios and having a variety of reactions that are still centered around their core personality or character trait. He is fleshed out a little more in the final arc, and I think that is really where he shines the brightest. But a decent amount of the characterization feels like a little too, like it feels like too little too late. I already have my impression and thoughts on Ryusui by that point. So while finding out more about him does add to his character, and I do like him more because of it, it it doesn't quite override the one note nature of his surface level first impression. I'd like to enjoy him more than I do, but the constant spouting of his greed gets old very quickly. And at some points, characters like Gen almost break the fourth wall by basically saying, "Yeah, we know, let's move on." So even the other characters get tired of his shtick. The panel of Senku as an ancient wizard in chapter 96 really makes me interested in seeing some kind of medieval version of Dr. Stone where Senku is a master wizard. The design is top notch and is used for a one off gag, but as a lover of high fantasy, I'd kill to see what Senku's brain could accomplish working off a universal language that isn't science or math, but rather mystical and magical. Just imagine if there was a video game like Baldur's Gate where you control Senku as maxed out intelligence stat but no physical it's like a survival horror game in a sense. Uh, and your goal is to revive humanity through magic. Like that would be incredible. That would be so much fun. And the trick is to build up your kingdom of science, and you get to choose how you lead your kingdom. What it could be, it could have portions of tactical uh turn-based strategy combat like Advanced Wars or Final Fantasy Tactics. Think like there's so many ways you could take this and it would be so fun. Now, the five generals of the Kingdom of Science don't quite add up to me. Senku makes complete sense for obvious reasons, for every reason in the book. Gen has basically become Senku's right hand man. His skills have been shown off in ways that have had a very tangible and positive effect on the kingdom, and he's been shown on numerous occasions to reach the same conclusion as Senku, either at the same time or only slightly behind him, so he also makes complete sense. Chrome is basically the only other legitimate scientist they have for most of the series, and as I said before, is really only behind Senku in terms of how much he knows, which can be equalized in time. He also comes up with inventive solutions on his own, time and time again, without any provocation, so he makes sense. Ryusui is where I start to question this lineup, since he's just come onto the scene in chapter 85, and the five generals are listed in chapter 96, only 11 chapters later. Beyond constantly shouting that he's greedy, he hasn't exactly done much of anything by that point, even proving his mastery of traversal. Sure, he brought currency back into effect, but it was Gen and Senku who provided the value needed to make the Drago a legitimately motivating incentive, where Ryusui just brought it into being, and it seems like he just expected the presence of money to work without backing it. He isn't even the one to create any of the currency. Instead, that falls to the unnamed Mr. Mangaka and the crafting team. He is shown to have a high level of mastery over air and sea transport, but the only actual thing he accomplishes by the point of the five generals being named is navigating himself, Senku, and Chrome through a storm while surveying the land in a hot air balloon. Yet it was Chrome who came up with the way to survive, and Ryusui just helped implement it. Because he ends up being extremely useful later on, I can see him making some sense. He grows into the role where the other three already fit their positions. But Ukyo is where Dr. Stone loses me. He has incredible hearing, but I don't understand how that translates to him being on the same level as the other four, and really the other three until Ryusui earns the title. Ukyo isn't shown to do anything that actually has an effect on the Kingdom of Science beyond helping the kingdom overthrow Tsukasa as a spy. And not much is done with this plot point beyond sneaking Chrome a battery when the Tsukasa Empire imprisons Chrome. Ukyo doesn't know how Chrome could possibly use the battery to get himself out. He just knows that Chrome had it on his person, so Ukyo doesn't even know that this is guaranteed to help Chrome out in any way. Every time Ukyo is focused on while in the Kingdom of Science, either someone else is also hearing whatever it is at the same time, or someone else realizes the solution to whatever problem they're facing before he does. like hearing Y Man for the first time, and the radar. Senku is the first to think of using radar, then Chrome is the next to understand what's happening, and only after it's basically completely done does Ukyo realize the device they created is radar. I just don't get why he's considered one of the five generals, beyond the fact that he has super hearing, which pales in comparison to the rest. Don't get me wrong, he is a very valuable asset, but he feels much more like a special ops force than a general. And he's even at the point where they split up to create, start actually working on the rocket. Four of the five generals stay in one group, and one of them goes off into one of the irrelevant characters groups. And can you guess which single character is left out? It's Ukyo, and he doesn't have a single thing to actually do in that part of the story. Senku, Gen, Chrome, and Ryusui all stick together, and they all get to do things that have a meaningful and tangible impact on the narrative as a whole. Ukyo gets nothing. Why is he one of the generals? It makes no sense, and it never will to me. Ryusui receives some flashbacks to his younger days, and these do a wonderful job of making the character likable, helped along greatly by the parallels to Senku. We have long grown attached to Senku, so showing that a new character is similar makes readers automatically start investing in the new one. This does end up being a bit of a double edged sword, though, because when you actually compare the two, Ryusa comes away as the far less interesting of the pair, and here's why. Their desires are similar on a fundamental level, where both are simply looking to improve their lives in some way, but it's the end result of those pursuits that really drives home the difference between them. Senku is shown having fun with his friends, Taiju and Yuzuriyo, together while improving and expanding his knowledge, something absolutely invaluable in life in general, and with two characters we're well acquainted with. Ryusui is shown enjoying an extremely decadent lifestyle, and while he is also enjoying that lifestyle with other people, they're all shown to be fawning toward him in some way, and they're all one time nameless appearances, meaning we as readers have absolutely nothing to engage with when it comes to Ryusui's supposed friends, and therefore really don't give a damn about them. There's also the matter of how their pursuits affect the world around them. Senku's pursuit of knowledge and scientific advancement is always, without fail, shown to directly benefit those around him in very positive ways. And there are numerous times where it's implied and basically outright stated that Senku chose those specific methods and inventions in order to help everyone else. At the end of the day, Senku comes across as solely interested in the betterment of mankind through science. On the other hand, while Ryusoi's pursuit does have a positive effect, similarly to Senku's, it's always shown to come from a place of selfishness rather than selflessness. Ryusoi does use this as a front for his true emotions from time to time, and those are the moments I feel most connected and engaged with his character. But the overall message is that Ryusoi is selfish. Now, as an inherently selfish person myself, I do relate decently to Ryusoi. I'm extremely selfish with my personal time, and selfishness is necessary sometimes in life so you aren't taken advantage of by others. But that's something I'm already intimately familiar with and understand, and one of my favorite things in life is learning. I don't learn anything from talking with someone who shares my beliefs and ideals. That's just an echo chamber. I only learn from talking with people who differ from me, and that's a big reason why I love so many of the characters in Dr. Stone. There are multiple different extreme personality types, and they are all extreme, but there are multiple different types, and it gives the Kingdom of Science a very rich and diverse feel. Ryusoi's flashbacks also provide a great look into one of the reasons of why these caricature-like characters work so well in Dr. Stone. Inagaki and Boichi make a big show of drawing attention to the surface level of each character's personality in a comedically evil or over the top manner, then taking their time and slowly feeding us bits of how that trait can actually be beneficial when properly applied. One of the greatest strengths of writing characters as caricatures is that whatever emotion or feeling you're trying to evoke in readers will come across extremely easily since you're basically shoving that trait in the reader's face. Once readers are accustomed to the new larger than life character, they can start to pick them apart and fully understand who that person is. We've already been given a piece of that puzzle, and with how interesting the overall narrative is, we're excited to dive into someone brand new and see how they not only enrich the world, but find out what role they fill in that world and how they provide a greater impact to the kingdom as a whole. You know, it took me until reading through Dr. Stone for this episode to realize that Gen's petrification crack is in the shape of half a sly grin. That is such a perfect detail for Gen to have, and yet it's never for 1 second focused on. That is masterful characterization, and it shows an incredibly deep knowledge of and confidence in your characters. The same is true for video games that contain hidden or secret areas, like the inverted castle in Castlevania Symphony of the Night. The creators know they've brought something incredible to life, and so have the confidence to not only allow their audience to figure out those details for themselves, but also trust in the intelligence of their audience. Why Man using Senku's voice is just weird to me. It's a pretty insane twist that ultimately goes absolutely nowhere. Since the culprit behind petrification, spoiler alert, in case you're still listening after the previous spoiler alert, is a hyper advanced alien species that has absolutely no connection whatsoever to Senku. This feels like a cheap and poorly executed way to raise the stakes and increase intrigue where it really didn't need any more. The Kingdom of Science has finally gotten its hands on the petrification device, and all the biggest questions still unanswered at this point revolve around petrification. It was the first major event to happen in the manga, so readers have been dying to know the inner workings. Now that they can study the device, you have all the intrigue necessary to keep readers hooked. The mass petrification was really wild, and we're finally going to find out how it worked. There's a level every reader has for how much suspense and intrigue they're willing to go along with. Too little intrigue, and people lose interest and stop reading. Too much intrigue, and people start to feel overwhelmed, like the act of reading is becoming work rather than fun. Narratives that have multiple overarching plots and characters have to maintain a fine balance on how much they spotlight at once. As the more expansive you go with your world, the easier it is to creep into information overload. This is most evident in stories that front end load the consumer with expositional or world building dumps like the anime The Rising of the Shield Hero. Starting off by introducing bunches of new concepts, characters, locations, etc., will immediately put off a lot of people from experiencing what you've created. In a sense, it's similar to developing a video game. You essentially have limitations on how much you can put in at any one time. And so, working within those constraints to maintain engagement with readers is one of the keys to success for the classic stories in history. A nice way to do this is through only bringing in the relevant pieces to each scene and moment, whatever is actually necessary to convey whatever it is you're trying to get across. Weaving in tiny details here and there as foreshadowing to later events is perfect for establishing something as relevant or that will be relevant later on without taking the focus off of the action. But why man using Senku's voice is given full focus and then there's no payoff for how or why it would. This plot point is brought back when the kingdom has Why Man activate the Medusa for them, which is really clever. But that doesn't count as a resolution because it doesn't answer any of the questions. It's also referenced when the Medusas are having the flashback at the end, but nothing gives a reason for why it has to happen that way, beyond the team behind Dr. Stone wanting it to. Yeah, it is intriguing and wild, but it has no real impact on the narrative. It could the voice that Y-Man uses could have just as easily been someone else's voice, and nothing, not a single event in the story would have changed. It's sort of like parentheses in a story. Whatever is in those parentheses is generally information that's not really necessary for the rest of the sentence or story as a whole. It's just put in there as sort of flavor text or a little bit of extra detail. And so it's not necessary, so it can be taken out. And that's what this is. That's what this feels like to me. A lot of what I bring up might come across as nitpicking, like this specific part of the story. But in a work of art like Dr. Stone, it's the tiny details like these that lessen my enjoyment and take me out of an otherwise extremely engaging read. Chapter 143 has Ryusui and Senku fighting over which method to take to get to America, and the one panel of Ryusui is 100% ripped straight from Sunken Rock, and you can't convince me otherwise. It's basically Ken's signature pose, with no shirt and arms fully extended to either side, and each individual muscle is outlined. This is just Ken's body with Ryusoi's head photoshopped onto it. And even the head looks like Rei's head, who's Yumi's bodyguard and stalker. So it's just disappointing. I don't know why he couldn't just do something new rather than rehashing the same design. Boichi's art is so good that it feels like he's trapped sometimes in drawing things one specific way, in the same way as Akira Toriyama's style, where it's so specifically Toriyama's that there's almost no variation between works. Dragon Ball is Toriyama's most well known work, but take a look at the artwork for one of the best games of all time, Chrono Trigger. Half of the main cast and more is just reused Dragon Ball character designs. Chrono is Goku, specifically Super Saiyan 4 Goku, if you're also counting the hair. Marl and Luca are two of Bulma's designs. Ayla is the wild version of Lunch. Magus is Kibito Kai, and it keeps going. There's also a straight up contradiction in chapter 154. The Mecha Senku Q&A at the end of chapter 153 says that Kikoyo, however you pronounce his name, the original chief of Ishigami Village and Kohaku and Ruri's father, stayed behind and didn't go on the trip to America. Yet after Senku creates soft serve ice cream, Kikoyo shows up in the panel with everyone reacting to how good it tastes. So I guess teleportation is just a technology that they automatically have without ever being stated. The final chapter, the final moment of chapter 160 is so cathartic and weighted with emotion. Chrome has been practicing rudimentary science his entire life until Senku shows up, and then his education skyrockets light years ahead. Yet he always feels like the underdog in the pair of scientists. Senku recognized Chrome's intelligence immediately, and so always let him do his own thing, knowing that no matter what Chrome got up to, he'd always be increasing his knowledge in arguably the most important way, practically. Practical knowledge is absolutely invaluable, as the more you have it, the more confidently you can work through situations and effectively apply what you know. You can sit around and learn facts, theories, laws, what have you, for years. But until that knowledge is put into practice, it's only so many words and numbers in your brain. Senku is extremely observant. So, from all the silent observation he and us as readers have done of Chrome's progress from legitimately primitive to basically modern day, hearing Senku fully acknowledge Chrome is just as capable as himself is true poetry. It's essentially a master seeing that his pupil is ready to graduate and happily passing on the torch, hence the chapter name of Torch of Science. I'm sure Senku would much rather be on the scene doing it himself because he'll be able to learn and put more of his knowledge into practice, but he is perfectly content sitting back and recovering, as much as someone like Senku can, knowing that he's left the fate of the reverse jailbreak in Chrome's hands. Now, there's all that positivity behind this scene, but it's a melancholy type of positivity. Senku's been sniped with a bunch of shrapnel, and even with his slapped together bulletproof shield, he's still in critical condition. One of the unspoken rules of this manga is that no protagonist dies. And this does become a very spoken rule at certain points, like centering the kingdom's blitzkrieg into the miracle cave around it. But this is one of the most serious wounds to happen to anyone in the series, and Senku was always spared from being legitimately injured. The stakes are entirely fresh in this conflict, with another one being the true ruthlessness and pragmatism of Zeno and Stanley. Other villains have been portrayed as ruthless and pragmatic, and the closest one is definitely Ibarra, but none of their actions show it quite like them. All Zeno needs is a moment to decide to assassinate someone he legitimately felt some kind of special bond with, showing that he is a sociopath through and through. And Stanley is 100% on board immediately, continuing his bloodthirsty pursuit long after it reasonably makes sense. Every other villain, with the exception of Ibarra, eventually come around to Senku's line of thinking, and these two do in the end as well, but no other villains are as effective or as vicious and merciless as Zeno and Stanley. Now, by the time Chelsea is introduced, I usually start to feel a little tired of more characters. We were just introduced to Zeno's people and have no idea who they are, yet, for some reason, we're swapping away from them and a brand new character who reads radar very accurately to focus on another new character. The Kingdom of Science is traversing the planet, so it could make sense to have them run into other people, but you have the built in excuse of worldwide petrification to fall back on in order to keep the cast size down to a manageable amount. It's sort of like how Senku warns about Dunbar's number, where 150 is the reasonable limit to how many people you can have in a group before it starts splintering. There's a limit to how many characters readers will care about, especially if you're not taking the time to actually flesh out the ones you already brought into the picture. If there were more morally gray characters, or ones after their own interests as third parties, that'd be one thing. But having a pretty hard split of characters being either good or evil and not much in between, coupled with every single character being larger than life, means the novelty and impact of writing new characters in such a way declines drastically. It just ends up feeling like more of the same. Now, during the chase sequence in South America, the pacing does start to fall away a little. Both groups seem to teleport to whatever their destination happens to be in a matter of pages, making it very hard to keep track of where each one is, especially in relation to the other, and where they're headed next at any given moment. It very quickly falls into a formula of Stanley is going to have Senku and company pinned down in short order, so the Kingdom of Science has to whip up something to help them get ahead. They have an extremely short window to create whatever it is and somehow miraculously finish it just in the nick of time. And this rinse and repeat gets old after just the first time because everything's happening too fast. No time is given to any of the devices they create. And so the overarching thread of logic that's been consistent is now thrown by the wayside in favor of getting to the climactic battle as quickly as possible. The final battle at the fort feels like the scene Inagaki envisioned beforehand and was stuck on how to bridge the gap to get there. With scenes like the line across the valley, and they have to send people over two at a time. For a moment, a couple characters worry about putting Hyoga and Zeno together, but nothing comes of it because everybody is just making sure that the story and narrative is progressing at as rapid a pace as possible. No real the right the writing of the story suffers a little bit. And this just feels like a holding area until we get to a more interesting part of the story. Senku petrifying the world again is such a brilliant move. It's the perfect in universe explanation for how to reset the stakes and bring the story back to a smaller scale. Of course, this allows for the most emotional part of the story, where Chalk the dog and Cigar the pig are given some actual screen time and allowed to be actual characters, and Soika is the only one petrified. This circular narrative development is extremely well handled. Soika, as a relatively major side character who's had numerous large and positive impacts, is now the star of the show, and it's up to her to depetrify the rest of the Kingdom of Science. Her journey to figure out the revival fluid is probably the best example in the entire manga of science being shown as accessible to everyone. It does take Soika 7 years to determine the correct solution, since she has to do it through the method that takes the longest. But despite the constant failures and seemingly never ending task, Soika perseveres until she eventually comes upon the right method. She's just an extremely helpful little girl from Ishigami Village, with no scientific background to speak of. Yet, through time and dedication, even she is able to succeed thanks to science. This sequence also just tugs at your heart with all the comparisons to Senku's initial time alone. It's one of the most well written of the entire series, and that is saying something for this manga. The only way I could see to improve it is if it had been extended somewhat. I would have loved to see more of Soika figuring out science and how to survive on her own. And while the emotional payoff of the sequence is already incredible, seeing a little more of Soika at work would have elevated Senku's revival just that much higher. But despite how short it is, this is my favorite moment in the series. Now, once Zeno and his team have been beaten, the only actual antagonist left is the original Wine Man. And so, because there isn't really a tangible face or name to put to the aliens until right at the very end, the stretch of chapters between the petrification and the Kingdom of Science landing on the moon does feel a little directionless at times. Sure, Y-Man is a much larger scale villain than any previously, and he's been around since the very beginning, which didn't we weren't aware of it until they heard that first transmission. But it exists on the moon. We have no idea what it is, looks like, sounds like, cares about, dreams of, etc., and can perform something that's essentially fantasy. At no point in that description is there a single point of reference for any human who has ever existed in the history of mankind to latch onto and become invested in. The closest that any human could ever get are astronauts who have actually been to the moon or been to outer space. That's about it. And it's still not realistic. The only thing actually driving interest towards Y-Man is the mystery of what it is. And for that to work effectively, the payoff needs to be spectacular. I'll talk about the ending in a little bit, but for now, I'll say I'm really just not a fan of how it plays out. When the narrative focuses on the work that directly leads to their rocket being built, the stakes feel more real rather than conceptual and nebulous. Even with this, however, the final section and later parts of the war between Zeno and Senku ultimately feel rushed. Most of, if not all, the problems the Kingdom of Science runs into are solved with no explanation and no fanfare. When Senku was trying to create antibiotics to heal Rory's pneumonia, that one piece of science takes a while to be resolved, going for multiple chapters and being an overarching plot, while smaller happenings occur while they're working towards that greater goal. Now, taking a look at something like fluorite, Senku says that's what they need next, and so they teleport to the Mediterranean and cast Accio fluorite, and it zooms into their hands. A single chapter Literally, a single chapter after fluorite has been brought up as necessary. They possess it. I get that with all the advances they've been able to make in the science they can perform, the work will become more streamlined and efficient so they aren't wasting as much time on failures. But fully committing to this realistic side of science means the narrative completely deflates. The proverbial air is let out and never fully returns. Once you get to this final stretch, there's no longer any reason to ask how will they make such and such happen, and no time is given to the readers to formulate their own speculations on how they think their story will go. You get the answer almost immediately, and every answer tends to be they just did it, as opposed to any sort of explanation. Part of the enjoyment and engagement that readers get out of the earlier parts of Dr. Stone is wondering how Senku and his people will be able to concoct whatever they're working to at the moment. And so the scientific devices they create become a part of the overall intrigue that drives readers to keep going. Take that away, and Dr. Stone loses one of the biggest and most important factors that sets it apart from the rest of the manga industry: making science accessible. One thing I do really like in the final section is that Dr. Stone actually explores the full implications of having mastery over petrification. Hyoga died during Stanley's assault on the kingdom's fortress, yet he's able to revive from being petrified, effectively making all of humanity immortal. And it is so refreshing to see a story explore not only the positives of power and knowledge, but also the true repercussions. Taikubo did something like this with the Hell chapter of Bleach, where each Shinigami who has a high enough level of Reiatsu is unknowingly sent to Hell, because allowing that much Reiatsu to disperse back into Soul Society would cause destabilization of the worlds. It's not given too much thought, and it's not focused on overly much, which is a bit of a shame. But the fact that it's given at all is really nice. And it shows that the team behind Dr. Stone really did think this thing through. They took the time to look at petrification from as many angles as they could, and I really appreciate that. And that also comes across in the numerous ways that the Kingdom of Science utilizes petrification to benefit them. Senku saying the trip to the moon can only be one way just honestly doesn't feel very true to me. It just feels like Senku's lying. Since they have the ability to make as much revival fluid and food as they want through Corn City, even if they're unable to figure out a way at that moment to make it happen, they can just revive more brilliant minds that somehow perfectly fit roles the Kingdom of Science needs. This also comes across as Inagaki cherry picking when the kingdom is able to instantly create a solution versus when they have to work for it, since for the vast majority of problems they run into for this arc, the answer is basically automatic, as I've laid out before. I would have been on board with this if it had happened during the Stone Wars arc or around that area, because there were limitations popping up left, right, and center back then. Senku always had to find a different way, to achieve his ideas due to not having a certain resource, or they hadn't progressed far enough, or what have you. By the time they've created a computer, the kingdom has felt like it's on easy street and just being given the answers on a silver platter instead of working for them and focusing on the difficult path they have to take to achieve whatever they're looking to get. I just can't shake the feeling that this was done purely to give Chrome and Soika something to do related to science to prove that they can still compete at the level of Senku and Zeno, and really Soika to give her something to show that she's caught up to Chrome. The payoff to all of Chrome and Soika's studying doesn't come until the literal end of the manga after they've already made the trip to the moon. All that happens is that they're on the team that's creating a time machine with Senku at the end. We don't know how far they've actually progressed. We don't know how much they're actually contributing to that project, although we can surmise based on how the rest of the story goes that Soika is constantly being ridiculously helpful while not thinking that she's actually that helpful and just trying to be as helpful as she can, and Chrome having flashes of inspiration. But Soika ultimately, unfortunately, doesn't get to contribute anything, and Chrome has the single impact of using a sextant in space. He comes up with that idea. But that's just normal Chrome, not Chrome after studying under Psi. We don't get to see the results of their studying and training. And that's a shame. Gen being surprised by Rory picking up Kohaku easily after being depetrified makes absolutely no sense whatsoever to me. In chapter 41, Rory is cured of pneumonia, and her first act is to run like a maniac, showing that she has the same body type as Kohaku, and it's commented on by one of the characters that Rory shares body type with Kohaku. Gen is fully present in that chapter, so he would have seen Rory's strength and known the sisters are on the same level. So why is he surprised at all that Rory is able to pick Kohaku up? It feels like an entirely unnecessary comedic reaction for the sake of comedy. And when the vast majority of the final arc is some kind of comedy or heavy handed emotion, I don't see why this was included. It's just unnecessary, and that space could have been used for some other character detail or just nothing. It becomes hard to tell the passage of time between events at certain points at the end, like where time jumps are happening constantly. 3 years supposedly passed between Senku and Zeno starting work on the rocket, and Zeno arriving in Japan with the finished engine, yet no one changes at all. In fact, the only times I can really think of where time passing actually has an effect on the world are during the initial mass petrification and Soika trying to depetrify everyone. The world changes drastically in 3700 years, so I'd be astounded if that the world will change drastically in 3700 years. So I'd be astounded if that wasn't included in a fictionalized version of a realistic Earth. Soika's 7 years are skipped over, but her appearance has changed a good amount. I can understand this happening for people like Kaseki, since your body stops changing as much the older you get, but for all the young characters, I can't imagine all of them would choose to stick with the same hairstyle for years on end, wear the exact same clothes every day, never grow facial hair, all of that. There's just no sign of physical growth or change in any of the characters beyond Soika. It just doesn't make any sense. So now to talk about the final reveal. Y Man being revealed as some machine alien life form is honestly really dumb and disappointing to me. Every piece of technology that's been shown in the series has been scientifically accurate and extremely realistic. And then here comes something completely out of science fiction, a robot alien. There is one way to look at the series that sort of causes this to make sense, but it still doesn't fully. If you look at each scientific advancement the Kingdom of Science has made, it starts extremely rudimentary and then slowly gets more impressive and catches up to modern day technology. So, something like aliens, as a staple part of science fiction and futuristic science, can make sense. The Kingdom of Science has surpassed modern day tech by that point, so it could make sense that the next step after is to go into the realm of sci fi. But the jump from rockets to parasitic aliens that have machine bodies is so great that I just shake my head in disbelief. the logic the Medusas follow is inherently flawed as well. During the flashback explanation of how the devices came to Earth, they think, despite eternal life, the beings remain petrified, never dying, but taking no further action. Then a few pages later, they ask, why do they not yearn to be petrified? With how tight the writing has been over the entire series, it's hard to believe that Inagaki would have just made a mistake here. So it seems like the Medusas don't understand that while petrified, humans can't do anything because they've turned to stone. What exactly are the Medusas expecting humanity to do in that state? What exactly is the further action they think humanity should and even can take while unable to move? This is just a case of trying to have your cake and eat it, and it just doesn't work. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. And it kills my enjoyment of the manga. I just do not like any part of this reveal. Now, moving on from that, the final pages of volume 26 say, "The end and to be continued." And there's a small line from Inagaki who says Dr. Stone will continue with manga, amongst other things. The one volume Byakuya reboot story was already out before Dr. Stone finished, and it's been stated by Inagaki that it's not canon, so I'm pretty excited to see where the universe goes, if it ever goes anywhere else. I don't have any speculations on where I think it could go, since the manga pretty much ran the gamut on important scientific discoveries, but I am hoping that at least one of them realizes that time travel really isn't a force that should be messed with. Although I could see that as the driving plot for a spin-off or sequel, now that I think about it. Where something like Senku's team is successful in making a time machine, and then in trying to rewrite the past positively, as was their initial goal, they screw it up in a major way. Which is, I mean, that it would be the typical time travel cliche plot point. Uh, But I mean, it is incredibly easy to mess up the chain of events that comprises time. And since we don't actually know what would happen if someone were able to change even a tiny thing from the past, there is really no way to experiment with it or have any kind of trial and error without instantly getting all kinds of errors. Going that route would open the door to an extremely interesting character arc for Senku to take, where he could have to learn that not all of science is good and that even he is no match for the unrelenting forces of the universe. Wow. Hour and a half. I really didn't think I'd be able to go for that long on my own, but that's my voice is starting to go. So I think I'll wrap it up here. That just about does it for my thoughts on Dr. Stone. Did I miss anything? Any of your favorite moments or characters? If there's anything that you'd like to hear me discuss, or if you'd like to come on for an episode, leave a comment or send me a message on DeviantArt, Lucky Fetish, or Discord as NeufAtora. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you on the next episode of the Best Book Club.